وين هي الدولة اللبنانية ترد؟ وين هي؟
Good afternoon. It is Tuesday, June 18th. I'm Yumna Nofal, and these are today's headlines. A delegation from the March 14 alliance hands President Sulaiman a memo that calls for Hezbollah's immediate pullout from Syria and the deployment of the Lebanese army along the border. The crisis in Syria dominates the two-day G8 leaders summit in Northern Ireland as Obama and Putin spar over how to end the war. And a bomb in Kabul kills 3 as NATO begins its security transition to Afghani forces. Breaking news, in the last hour, sniper activity was ongoing in Abra in Saida, and a shell landed near Harid Saida's roundabout, causing 1 casualty. Tight security measures are taken in Abra, and all roads leading to the neighborhoods are blocked. Media outlets are reporting that Sheikh Mohammed al-Asir supporters and those of Mohammed al-Sus exchanged heavy gunfire. Another local news, a delegation from the March 14 alliance handed President Michel Sulaiman a memo that is calling for Hezbollah's immediate pullout from Syria and the deployment of the Lebanese army along the border with the war-torn country. The delegation to Babda Palace was headed by future bloc leader MP Fouad Senora, who later held a press conference at the parliament along with several March 14 MPs to reveal the details of the memo, its second Sulaiman in 9 months. Around 50 signatories called for Hezbollah's full and immediate withdrawal from Syria, pending a solution to the problem of its arms. The signatories claimed that the party's role in the fighting is a clear violation of the constitution, the sovereignty of the Lebanese state, and international resolutions. They asked Sulaiman to deploy the Lebanese army on the northern and eastern border with Syria with the assistance of UN peacekeepers and to control the crossings with the neighboring country. European Union Foreign Policy Chief Catherine Ashton kicked off her second-day official visit to Beirut by meeting with President Sulaiman at the Babda Palace. Ashton reportedly cancelled her scheduled meetings with Prime Minister-designate Tamam Salam and caretaker Foreign Minister Adnan Mansour to visit UNIFIL headquarters in Naoura instead. The EU chief, accompanied by EU Ambassador to Lebanon Angelina Eichhorst, also held talks with Speaker Nabih Berri at Ain al-Tini. On Monday, the EU official discussed with caretaker PM Najib Miati the current situation in the country and the region and ties with the European Union. She is set to announce a new figure of European aid to Lebanon and neighboring countries, taking into consideration the probability of an upsurge in refugees following the escalating confrontations in Syria that could even grow stronger in the next 3 months. Meanwhile, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees Antonio Guterres is appealing for aid for Lebanon as it copes with massive numbers of refugees. Take a look.
I have no doubt that the Syrian crisis is not only one of the most dramatic humanitarian crises that we have faced since the Cold War, but it is the most dangerous one. And the risks of spillover and the risks of negative impact on the countries of the region are enormous, and I believe massive support is required. I believe it's high time for the international community to join efforts to stop this fighting. But in between, it is absolutely essential to do everything in order to preserve this fighting in Syria to become an explosion in the Middle East, in order to support countries to preserve their stability, and no country is more directly impacted and threatened than Lebanon. So my very strong appeal is for massive support, not only to the refugees, not only to the local communities, but to Lebanon itself.
The crisis in Syria is being discussed at the two-day G8 Leaders Summit in Northern Ireland, which began yesterday. The United States said last week it would step up military aid to Syrian rebels, a move which officials said would involve supplying the Western-backed Supreme Military Court with automatic weapons, light mortars and rocket-propelled grenades. The European Union has also dropped its arms embargo on Syria, allowing France and Britain to arm the rebels. This comes as Northern Ireland's political leaders warned G8 leaders to think very carefully before arming the rebels. As the Power Summit was taking place in Lough, former IRA Republican guerrilla Martin McGuinness spoke to journalists a few miles down the road.
My own personal view is that putting more armed people, putting more weapons into a country can exacerbate the situation. Whilst at the same time we have to recognise that something like well over 90,000 people have lost their lives in Syria. I come at this from the perspective of trying to encourage peace processes. This is an example of how conflict can be resolved. What was the key ingredient in resolving our conflict? There had to be a will and a desire among all of the main participants to bring the misery of conflict and war to an end. And that's where some of these other people need to get to. If you want an example of a potential peace process that went badly wrong, you only have to look as far as what happened in Sri Lanka.
U.S. President Barack Obama sparred with Russia's Vladimir Putin over how to end the war in Syria during an icy encounter at the G8 summit, where divisions over the conflict eclipsed the rest of the agenda. In their first face-to-face meeting in a year, Obama said the two men had different views on Syria, but shared an interest in stopping violence and ensuring chemical weapons were not being used.
We do have differing perspectives on the problem, but we share an interest in reducing the violence, securing chemical weapons, ensuring that they're neither used nor are they subject to proliferation, and that we want to try to resolve the issue through political means if possible, and so we will instruct our team to continue to work on the potential of a Geneva follow-up to the first meeting. Discussions on North Korea and Iran were very productive, and we both agreed to consult closely on the North Korean issue, and in Iran we both expressed cautious optimism that with a new election there we may be able to move forward on a dialogue that allows us to resolve the problems with Iran's nuclear program. And finally, we have a discussion about the fact as the two nuclear superpowers, we have a special obligation to try to continue to reduce tensions, to build on the work that we did with New START, and to lead the world in both nuclear security issues and proliferation issues.
Coming up next, a Japanese rail company offers one lucky couple the chance to get married aboard one of Tokyo's busiest trains. Stay with us. A palm-darketed senior Muslim cleric in the west of Kabul, police said, shortly before the international military coalition marked its final handover of security to national forces in Afghanistan. At least 3 civilians were killed and 21 wounded in the blast, which is bound to fuel concern over how the 352,000-strong Afghan security forces will tackle an intensifying insurgency after most foreign combat troops leave the country by the end of 2014. The explosion happened as Muhammad Muhaqiq, a prominent Hazara politician and the country's senior cleric, passed by the area in a convoy, according to Interior Ministry spokesman Sadiq Siddiqui. Muhaqiq is also a senior member of the body set up by President Hamid Karzai in 2010 to help broker the peace pact with the Taliban, the High Peace Council. NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen said Afghanistan will continue to receive support as the international military coalition marks its final handover to national forces.
The main effort of our forces is shifting from combat to support. We will continue to help Afghan troops in operations if needed, but we will no longer plan, execute or lead these operations. And by the end of 2014, our combat mission will be completed. At that time, Afghanistan will be fully secured by Afghans. The aim is to train, advise and assist Afghan forces. We will also play our part in the broader international efforts to ensure the long-term sustainment of the Afghan security forces. This will be another visible demonstration that Afghanistan does not stand alone now or in the future.
A heavy police presence remained at Istanbul's Taksim Square a day after protesters were prevented from accessing the site. Several hundred union members marched in sympathy with anti-government demonstrations, joining protesters that have presented Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan with the greatest public challenge to his 10-year leadership. But they were prevented from entering the square, the focal point of the unrest. After workers had moved off, between 200 and 300 mainly young protesters, some of them throwing stones from slingshots, fought with police. The silent protests were in stark contrast to demonstrations at the weekend, which saw some of the fiercest clashes so far when police fired tear gas and water cannon to clear thousands from Taksim Square. A suicide bomber has blown himself up inside a mosque in the Iraqi capital, killing at least 7 worshippers. More than 20 people were wounded in Tuesday's attack in the Al-Qaeda district of northern Baghdad. The suicide bomber detonated himself among the worshippers who were gathering after the call to prayer, according to policeman Furat Faleh, who was near the site of the blast. The latest violence comes a week after a series of blasts across the country left at least 48 people dead. More than 1,000 people were killed in attacks in Iraq during May, according to the UN, making it the deadliest month since the sectarian bloodletting of 2006 and 2007. Both Sunnis and Shias have been targeted in an intensifying wave of violence since the beginning of this year. And now for some world headlines in brief. In some of the biggest protests since the end of Brazil's 64-85 dictatorship, demonstrations have spread across this continent-sized country and united people from all walks of life behind frustrations over poor transportation, health services, education, and security despite a heavy tax burden. More than 100,000 people were in the streets on Monday for largely peaceful protests in at least 8 big cities. They were in large motivated by widespread images of Sao Paulo police last week beating demonstrators and firing rubber bullets into groups during a march that drew 5,000. Coalition party leaders welcomed a court ruling to reopen the country's state broadcaster in Greece and said they would hold further talks with the Prime Minister in a few days. A Greek court ruled that state broadcaster ERT must reopen immediately, court officials said, but the opening is only until a new broadcaster is launched. The ruling, which ordered ERT switched back on until a restructured public broadcaster is launched, came 6 days after the government switched it off the air as part of the austerity reforms of a broadcaster it called corrupt and inefficient. And former South African President Nelson Mandela spends a 10th day in hospital. His daughter Zinani Mandela, who visited him in hospital, said he was doing very well. The 94-year-old anti-apartheid leader, who became South Africa's first black president in 1994, was rushed to hospital early on June 8 with a recurring respiratory infection. Well-wishers continue to send messages of support outside Mandela home in Newton. A rail company is offering one lucky couple the chance to get married aboard one of Tokyo's busiest commuter trains as it encircles the Japanese capital. East Japan Railway said it wanted to find a couple who would like to tie the knot aboard the usually heavy Yamanote line and the company of up to 120 friends and family. Guests will have exclusive use of the 11-car train, which normally carries around 1,000 tightly packed commuters. The train will take an hour to travel the around 35-kilometer Yamanote line, stopping at all 29 stations but not opening its doors. The nature of the journey will pose one possible challenge. There is no toilet aboard. The winning couple can arrange the ceremony as they wish, but most host and pay for the ensuing wedding reception at a hotel run by the firm. The sight of train enthusiasts forming platforms to take pictures of even the most regular-looking locomotives is not unusual in Japan, a country where hobbies are taken very seriously. Talk about love and carriage. Let me remind you of today's headlines. A delegation from the March 14 alliance hands President Sulaiman a memo that calls for Hezbollah's immediate pullout from Syria and the deployment of the Lebanese army along the border. The crisis dominates the 2-day G8 leaders summit in Northern Ireland as Obama and Putin spar over how to end the war in Syria. And a bomb in Kabul kills 3 as NATO begins its security transition to Afghani forces. Those are your Tuesday headlines live on Future Television in Beirut. I'm Yumna Naufal. Please make sure to tune in tomorrow at 4:20. Linda Tamim will be here. Have a good night.
وين هي الدولة اللبنانية ترد؟ وين هي؟